December 22, 1941. Clark Field, Luzon, the Philippines. The morning heat was already thick by 9 a.m., clinging to the corrugated roofs of hangars still scarred from Japanese bombing runs days earlier. Dust rose in lazy spirals from the tarmac as a small column of olive-drab tanks, barely taller than a man, rattled past, their engines coughing like smokers. Captain William Bill Chandler of the U.S. 192nd Tank Battalion wiped sweat from his brow and leaned out the hatch of his M3 Stuart. "Feels like we're driving tin cans, Sergeant," he muttered. Inside, his gunner, Sergeant Frank Dorsey, laughed. "If it moves faster than those Jap tanks, I'll call it a Cadillac." But on the other side of the battle line, Japanese observers weren't so impressed. From a ridge overlooking the valley, Major Kenji Nishi, a rising officer in the Imperial Japanese Army's 7th Tank Regiment, peered through his field glasses. Below, he watched the American Stuarts rumble awkwardly over the rough terrain, each one bristling with antennas, crewmen sweating, tracks churning through sand and clay. "Are these the famous American tanks?" one of his lieutenants asked, smirking. Nishi lowered his binoculars. "So it seems. Light armor, thin gun. They're no match for our Type 95s or even our 37mm crews." He turned to his men and chuckled, a quiet, confident laugh that spread through the ranks. To the Japanese command, the M3 Stuart was a toy, a fast but fragile machine that would crumple under even moderate fire. The Americans, they thought, didn't understand jungle warfare. But the jungles of Luzon were about to prove both sides wrong. By afternoon, the air was thick with the sound of distant artillery. The first clashes between the U.S. and Japanese armored units had begun along the north road to Demortis. Chandler's platoon was ordered to delay the Japanese advance, to buy time for the infantry retreating toward Bataan. As the Stuarts rolled into position, the men could hear the whine of enemy shells overhead. Trees cracked and splintered. The earth shook beneath them. Chandler's tank lurched as they reached the forward slope. "Targets ahead, 1 o'clock, Dorsey shouted from inside the turret. Through the gun sight, he spotted the silhouettes of Japanese Type 95 Heigo tanks, 3 of them, cresting a ridge less than a mile away. The Type 95 was the pride of Japan's armored forces. Fast with a 37mm gun and thin armor designed for speed, it had swept through China and Malaya without contest. Now its crews prepared to add American Stuarts to that list. The Japanese tanks fanned out in a textbook formation, their turrets swiveling as they advanced. Chandler barked into the intercom, "Load AP! Range 800! The loader slammed around into the Stuart's 37mm gun. Dorsey adjusted his aim, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. Crack. The recoil rocked the small tank. A second later, the lead Type 95 erupted in a ball of orange flame. Hit. The other 2 Japanese tanks swung their turrets, returning fire. Their shells whistled past, one striking a tree barely feet from Chandler's vehicle. Shards of metal pinged off the Stuart's hull. Chandler gritted his teeth. "Move, keep moving!" The little tank lunged forward, its Continental engine roaring as it darted between palm trees and through shallow ditches. The Japanese crews fired again, but the Stuarts were already gone, using their speed to circle behind them. When the second Stuart appeared out of the brush, it was less than 100 meters from the enemy's flank. 3 quick shots later, both remaining Type 95s were smoking wrecks. The Japanese officers watched in stunned silence from their observation post. Nishi's earlier laughter evaporated. The Stuart wasn't supposed to win, but the truth was dawning quickly. In the jungles and rough hills of the Philippines, the M3's weaknesses became strengths. Its light armor let it maneuver through soft terrain. Its engine rarely overheated in tropical humidity, and its speed, nearly twice that of the Japanese Heigo, turned it into a hunter. Chandler climbed out of the turret, grinning despite the smoke and chaos. "Tell Washington," he shouted to his crew, "the tin can bites back." Behind him, the wreckage of Japanese armor burned hot against the afternoon sun. The laughter that had once echoed from their ranks was gone, replaced by uneasy silence. January 10, 1942. Near Balanga, Bataan Peninsula, Philippines. The sound of the Stuart's engine was a steady growl, comforting in its consistency. Around it, the jungle was alive. Cicadas shrieked from the canopy. Vines dangled low, and the air hung heavy with damp heat and gunpowder. Captain Chandler's tank crept through the overgrown path, treads grinding over roots slick with rain. Inside, the crew was soaked in sweat. The M3's interior was a metal oven. Temperatures climbed above 110 degrees, and the smell of fuel and oil was constant. "Feels like hell in here," muttered Dorsey, his shirt plastered to his back. "Better hell than surrender," Chandler replied. They'd been fighting for weeks now, retreating ever deeper into Bataan. The Japanese controlled the skies and much of the coast. The Americans were running on dwindling fuel, ammunition, and rations. Yet the Stuarts, those tin cans, kept moving. When the infantry needed an escape route, the M3s led the way. When Japanese tanks threatened a flank, they counterattacked with astonishing speed. And when the terrain seemed impassable, mud, vines, fallen trees, the Stuarts simply charged through. To the infantrymen slogging through the jungle on foot, the little tanks were godsends. "You hear that engine?" one private said, "and you know we ain't alone." Far to the north, Japanese officers gathered around a field map inside a commandeered church. The stone walls echoed with dripping rain and murmured voices. Major Kenji Nishi stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back. His regiment had suffered unexpected losses. 3 Type 95s destroyed, another disabled by mechanical failure. The enemy's light tanks were not the weaklings he'd dismissed weeks earlier. "Reports from the front indicate that the American M3 is faster than we anticipated," said a lieutenant, his voice uneasy. "Their crews strike quickly and withdraw before our guns can target them." Nishi frowned. "Speed is irrelevant if we control the ground. Their armor cannot withstand a direct hit." "Yes, sir," the lieutenant replied, though he didn't sound convinced. The problem wasn't just speed. The terrain favored the Americans in ways the Japanese hadn't expected. The dense jungle restricted movement, nullifying their artillery support. And while the Type 95 was lighter and slightly smaller, its thin armor, only 12 millimeters at its thickest, was vulnerable even to machine gun fire when hit at close range. Meanwhile, the Stuart, though lightly armored by Western standards, was better sealed, better ventilated, and crucially, more reliable. The Japanese tanks, designed for China's plains, struggled in the wet, uneven ground of the Philippines. Their engines overheated. Their transmissions jammed. Nishi's confidence was beginning to crack. Back in the jungle, Chandler's platoon reached a clearing overlooking a small village. Smoke rose from thatched huts. Japanese infantry were advancing through the palm grove. The Stuarts halted at the tree line. "Targets, infantry with light anti-tank guns about 200 meters, Dorsey called out. "Coke's gun, full burst," Chandler ordered. The .30 caliber Browning beside the main gun opened up, spitting fire through the foliage. Tracers cut through the humidity like streaks of light, scattering the enemy. Grenades went off in the distance, sharp, concussive cracks followed by screams. Then came the return fire. A 37mm shell slammed into the Stuart's frontal plate, denting but not penetrating. The tank rocked violently. Inside, the crew ducked instinctively. "Minor hit!" "Armor's holding," shouted the loader. "Good," Chandler said grimly. "Let's return the favor." The Stuart's main gun barked once, then twice. The enemy's position exploded in a spray of dirt and smoke. Through the haze, they could see Japanese soldiers retreating, dragging wounded men with them. As the battle subsided, Chandler leaned out of his hatch, scanning the wreckage. The Stuart was scratched, scorched, and reeking of cordite, but still alive. "Write that in the report," he said to his radio operator. "They can dent us, but they can't stop us." Weeks later, when the American lines finally broke and the order to surrender came, Chandler's men were among the last tankers to destroy their vehicles, pouring gasoline over their trusted Stuarts before setting them alight. They watched the flames consume the machines that had carried them through jungle and blood. For the Japanese, the victory at Bataan was complete. But the impression the Stuart left on their officers, its speed, its resilience, its sheer defiance, lingered long after the smoke cleared, and in Burma, not far across the sea, the tin can would rise again, this time with British and Indian crews behind its controls. May 1942, the Burmese jungle north of Rangoon. The monsoon rains had just begun. Sheets of water poured through the canopy, turning trails into rivers of mud and the air into a suffocating cloud of heat and decay. To most soldiers, Burma felt like the end of the world, a place where metal rusted. Overnight, and even the jungle itself seemed to want you dead. But for the men of the British 7th Armored Brigade, and their American-built M3 Stuarts. It was the beginning of something unexpected. Captain James Jimmy, porter of the Royal Armored Corps, leaned out of his hatch, rain streaming down his goggles. His column of Stuarts was crawling through the forest on a narrow, half-flooded path. To his left, Gurkha infantry waded waist-deep through the muck, rifles held above their heads. Porter keyed his throat mic. "Keep the revs steady, lads. Don't bog her down. She'll carry through if you let her breathe." Inside the cramped tank, the crew worked like clockwork, the driver feathering the clutch, the gunner adjusting the sight on the 37mm cannon, the loader wiping sweat from his eyes between shells. Despite the conditions, the Stuart's engine and the Continental radial barn purred steadily. The vehicle seemed to relish the challenge. That was its secret. Where heavier British tanks faltered, the Stuart thrived. Its wide tracks and light frame let it glide over terrain that would have swallowed a Churchill whole. And its air-cooled engine, unlike the Japanese Type 95s, didn't choke in the humidity. In the village ahead, Japanese forces were dug in, a mixture of infantry, machine gun nests, and a few Type 95 Hagos. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant Masaru Ota, watched through binoculars as the British column appeared out of the trees. He smirked. "Light tanks," he muttered. "They will burn like paper." His men had fought Chinese forces before, and their tanks had been primitive, slow, undergunned, easily broken. The M3 Stuart, though unfamiliar, looked similar enough to underestimate. Oda ordered his tanks into position. The first shell from a Japanese 37mm gun screamed across the clearing, slamming into the lead Stuart. It tore through the track skirt, splintering metal. The tank rocked but didn't explode. Instead, it revved louder, pushing forward despite the damage. Then, the Stuarts returned fire. Their 37mm cannons cracked like thunder, firing armor-piercing rounds at blinding speed. One Japanese tank was hit square in the turret. The shell punched through, igniting the ammunition inside. A fireball erupted, throwing its hatch skyward. "On target! Shift left!" shouted Porter, guiding his gunner. The Stuarts moved in pairs, flanking, weaving, and their light frames dancing between the palms. The Japanese guns couldn't traverse fast enough. Within minutes, the defenders were in chaos. By the time the firing stopped, smoke and steam rose from burning tanks and shattered huts. Rain hissed as it hit smoldering wreckage. Later, as the captured Japanese survivors sat under guard, one of them stared at the destroyed Stuarts in disbelief. "How?" he muttered to his interpreter. "They are so small, so fast. We fired again and again." The interpreter shrugged. "They are built differently. They don't stop moving." Indeed, that was the key. The Stuart was never meant to fight toe-to-toe with heavy armor. It was meant to move, to scout, flank, and strike where the enemy least expected. In Burma's jungle maze, where the terrain punished any tank foolish enough to stand still, mobility was survival. Weeks turned into months. The Stuarts pressed on through rain and disease, escorting supply convoys, supporting infantry assaults, even ferrying wounded men out of combat zones when no trucks could pass. Mechanics joked that the tank was half scout, half miracle. One British tanker described it best. "You don't drive the Stuart, you ride it. Like a horse that knows its own way through the mud." By late 1943, Japanese command began issuing urgent reports. Enemy light tanks, unexpectedly fast, accurate fire, difficult to destroy. The same officers who had once laughed at the M3 now called it the mosquito that kills. And as Allied forces began their long push back through Burma, the Stuart led the way, its gun short, its armor thin, but its spirit unbreakable. In the jungles where even tigers feared to tread, the little American tank became legend. February 1944. Arakan Front, Burma. The morning mist hung low, clinging to the trees like a gray shroud. You could barely see 50 yards ahead, and yet the sound of engines cut through the fog, the unmistakable growl of M3 Stuarts advancing in formation. Lieutenant David McAllister of the 7th Light Cavalry sat hunched in the turret of his tank. "Honey," as the British affectionately called the M3. His goggles were fogged, his hands blistered from the heat radiating off the metal, but his grin was unmistakable. "Keep her steady, lads. The Japs are close." Ahead, Japanese anti-tank guns were dug into the tree line. camouflaged beneath palm fronds and jungle brush. They had been waiting for heavy British armor, slow-moving targets they could ambush. Instead, the Stuarts came roaring through the mist like ghosts. McAllister's driver, Corporal Singh, throttled forward, the tracks cutting clean through soft earth. Within seconds, they were within firing range. "Target! 2 o'clock, trench line," McAllister shouted. The 37mm barked, spitting a shell that tore through the jungle fog. The first blast flattened a Japanese position. The second silenced a gun nest before it could even fire. What followed was chaos, the good kind from the Allied perspective. The Stuarts darted across the clearing, firing, retreating, circling, confusing the defenders. Japanese crews struggled to track them with their slower traversing guns. "Move! Move! Keep them guessing!" McAllister yelled. The Stuart was light, yes, but that lightness was a weapon. Its acceleration made it a blur in the jungle. It could pivot, reverse, or flank within seconds. Against rigid Japanese tactics built on ambush and precision, the Stuarts' unpredictability was deadly. By noon, the battle was over. Smoke curled above the burning anti-tank positions, and the clearing was littered with twisted metal. The Stuarts had taken some hits, a few with shrapnel scars, one missing a track, but most were still rolling. As the British infantry moved up, one of them called out to McAllister's tank, grinning. "Not bad for a toy tank, eh, sir?" McAllister laughed, patting the turret. "A toy? Maybe. But I'll take this over any fancy brute that can't climb a hill." The Japanese, meanwhile, began to realize something deeply unsettling. Reports filtered back to Regional Command from Burma, the Philippines, even New Guinea, describing the same tank, the same tactics, the same result. A Japanese intelligence briefing from 1944 noted with frustration, "Enemy light tank, type Stuart, inferior armor and gun but fast and numerous, hard to hit in jungle, uses swarming tactics, dangerous." Officers who had once laughed at the M3 now studied it obsessively. Some suggested using heavier anti-tank guns, but few could be deployed in such dense terrain. Others recommended building faster tanks. But Japan lacked the industrial base to match Allied production. The Stuart, mass-produced in the thousands, became a symbol of the industrial and tactical divide between the two sides. In the Philippines, American crews took those lessons even further. When the 44th Tank Battalion landed on Luzon in early 1945, their Stuarts were some of the first Allied tanks to see action against Japanese defenders entrenched in the hills. Lieutenant Tom Reyes recalled the moment they broke through a Japanese roadblock near San Jose. "They had the range on us, sure, but we were faster. We'd cut the corner, fire twice, and vanish before they could reload. It was like boxing, jab, move, jab again. They couldn't keep up." His words captured the spirit of the Stuart in the Pacific. It wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but it refused to play by the enemy's rules. Even when ambushed, the Stuart's agility could turn the tide. Crews learned to use terrain, weaving between rice paddies, crashing through bamboo, and even using smoke shells to create their own jungle fog. To Japanese tankers, it was infuriating. To Allied soldiers, it was poetry in motion. By mid-1944, Allied commanders across the Pacific had one consistent message: send the Stuarts forward first, because they always came back, fast, dirty, and victorious. The little tank that everyone had once laughed at had become the hunter. And by the time the Japanese finally understood that speed was a weapon all its own, it was far too late. Late 1944, Luzon, the Philippines. The rain fell in thick sheets, hammering the jungle canopy like artillery. Every drop hit with a sound that could almost mask the low mechanical rumble of engines. Almost. Beneath the storm, a column of M3 Stuarts from the 44th Tank Battalion wound through a muddy mountain road, their treads splashing through rivers that had once been roads. Inside one of them sat Sergeant Joe Tex Harlan, chewing on a piece of gum and squinting through the rain-smeared glass of his periscope. He'd driven tanks across North Africa, but this was something else entirely. "Jungle don't make no sense," he muttered, adjusting the throttle. "You can't see 10 feet and somehow there's still room for an ambush." From the turret above, his commander, Lieutenant Tom Reyes, scanned the trees. "Keep her steady, Tex. We'll hit that Japanese strongpoint in 5. Lightning flashed, revealing a steep ravine below and a crumbling bridge ahead. The Stuart's narrow frame was their only chance. A Sherman would have sunk the bridge instantly. But the little Stuart rolled across like a cat on a wire, light, balanced, graceful. The convoy followed, the tanks crawling through the storm one by one. On the far side, the road widened into a clearing where Japanese troops had built a hidden supply post. Bunkers dug into a hillside, covered in palm fronds. Reyes spotted the muzzle flash first. "Contact! 2 o'clock, machine gun nest!" Tech slammed the tank into cover as the 37mm barked once, twice. The enemy gun erupted in flames. The Stuarts fanned out like wolves, circling, their small frames weaving between trees and fallen logs. To the Japanese defenders, it looked like madness. Tanks moving where tanks shouldn't move, firing, disappearing, then reappearing behind them. The jungle, once their greatest weapon, had turned against them. In reports sent back to headquarters, American officers began using a new nickname for the M3, the Jungle Greyhound. It was fast, fearless, and seemingly untouchable. The Stuart's air-cooled radial engine, originally designed for aircraft, was perfectly suited to tropical combat. It didn't choke on humidity or clog with dust the way Japanese Type 95 Hagos did. Its tracks were narrow but strong, giving it remarkable traction in mud. Japanese soldiers often joked grimly that the Stuart was the tank that never gets stuck. But the secret wasn't just in its mechanics, it was in how the crews used it. Unlike the rigid tactics of Axis forces, American and Commonwealth tank crews improvised constantly. They worked hand in hand with infantry, with communication lines open and fluid. A Stuart commander might call in air support 1 minute, then personally lead a flanking charge the next. In Burma, one British report described an entire Japanese battalion being routed not by heavy armor, but by 5 Stuarts moving like cavalry, and that's exactly what they were, mechanized cavalry. Still, there were moments when the Stuart's light armor showed its limits. During one brutal encounter near Mandalay, a Japanese Type 1 anti-tank gun scored a direct hit on the lead Stuart in a column. The shell punched through its side and ignited the ammunition rack, sending the turret skyward. The rest of the crew bailed out, some alive, most not. But within seconds, another Stuart rolled into position and fired 3 rapid shots. The enemy gun fell silent. The second tank's commander, a young lieutenant from Wales named Arthur Niven, refused to retreat. He advanced alone until infantry caught up. When later asked why, Niven simply replied, "Because we couldn't let them think the little tank could bleed." That became the unspoken creed of every Stuart crew in the Pacific. Their armor was thin, their guns small, but their pride was massive. They learned to use everything: smoke rounds, flanking maneuvers, terrain masking, even deception. Crews would sometimes attach fake logs or brush to their hulls, making their silhouettes appear larger, like Shermans or even British Grants, forcing Japanese spotters to misjudge the threat. And while Japanese Type 97 Chiha tanks were larger and better armed, they lacked the speed and agility of the Stuart. In open ground, the Stuart could circle them before they could traverse their turret. Tank duels often ended before the Japanese even fired a shot. By early 1945, in the jungles of Burma and the Philippines, a strange truth had taken hold among both sides. To the Americans and British, the M3 Stuart was a symbol of ingenuity, proof that speed and teamwork could overcome raw firepower. To the Japanese, it became a specter, a mechanical ghost that struck fast and vanished before revenge could come. The laughter that had once greeted the Stuart's arrival had turned to reluctant respect, and in war, respect born of fear was the most honest kind of all. May 1945. Northern Luzon, Philippines, the jungle was finally quiet. The last echoes of battle had faded into the mountains, leaving behind a landscape torn between ruin and rebirth. Amid the shattered palms and scorched undergrowth sat a battered but still running M3 Stuart, engine idling softly, hull streaked with mud and bullet scars. Lieutenant Tom Reyes climbed out of the turret and took off his helmet, wiping his face with a dirty sleeve. Behind him, Sergeant Harlan stood beside the track, cigarette dangling from his lips. The 2 men stared across the valley where columns of surrendering Japanese troops were being herded by Filipino guerrillas and U.S. infantry. Reyes exhaled slowly. "You remember when they said this thing wasn't a real tank?" Harlan smirked, tapping the Stuart's armor with his boot. "Yeah, guess someone forgot to tell her that." The little tank had survived 2 years of the harshest terrain the Pacific could throw at it. Swamps, jungle, monsoon, volcanic slopes. It had outrun, outmaneuvered, and outlasted enemies who once mocked it. But the Stuart's story wasn't just about survival. It was about a new kind of warfare that rewrote what tanks could be. At the start of the war, tanks were seen as heavy beasts meant for open fields, steel giants locked in slugging matches. Germany's Panzers, Britain's Matildas, Japan's Chiha, all built on the idea that armor and firepower ruled the battlefield. The Stuart flipped that logic on its head. It proved that speed, coordination, and reliability could achieve what brute force could not. In the dense jungles of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, where every road became a trap and every tree hid a gun, the Stuart's mobility became its deadliest weapon. Japanese commanders learned that lesson the hard way. Their tanks, designed for China's plains and fast infantry support, were helpless in narrow trails where an M3 could dart between cover like a snake. Even when Japanese anti-tank guns scored kills, more Stuarts followed, a testament to the American supply, machine that could replace losses faster than Japan could, build new weapons, captured Japanese officers later, admitted their shock at facing the M3. One colonel, interviewed after the war, recalled, "We thought it was a toy, but it was not the tank, it was the men inside it, and the number that kept coming." He wasn't wrong. The United States built over 13,000 M3 Stuarts, sending them not only to the Pacific but to Britain, the Soviet Union, and even Free French forces. They fought everywhere, from the sands of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, earning nicknames like Honey, Stuart, and Jungle Greyhound. No one laughed anymore. In Burma, British Commonwealth forces credited their Stuarts with breaking through Japanese roadblocks that had held for weeks. In the Philippines, Filipino tankers trained on the same machines, using them in the liberation of their homeland. And after the war, many nations kept the Stuart in service for years, its simple mechanics and light frame perfect for training and patrol duty. Some even fought again in Korea, India, and Latin America. But for those who crewed them first, in the steaming jungles of 1942 and 1943, the memory was more personal. They remembered the sound, the fast, eager growl of the Continental engine, the way the thin armor rattled under small arms fire but kept going anyway, the teamwork between driver, gunner, and commander that made the difference between victory and disaster. They remembered how the enemy used to laugh, and how that laughter died out one jungle battle at a time. By the time the war ended, the M3 Stuart had earned something far more enduring than fame or fear. It had earned respect. Not for being the biggest or the strongest, but for proving that innovation and adaptability could turn a supposed weakness into an unstoppable strength. In a war defined by extremes, heavy bombers, massive tanks, and unimaginable destruction, the Stuart's legacy was something simpler, almost poetic. It was the story of an underdog machine that refused to fight on anyone else's terms. As Lieutenant Reyes and Sergeant Harlan climbed back into their Stuart for the last time, the sky broke open with sunlight through the thinning storm. The little tank rolled forward, tracks biting into the wet earth, heading down the trail toward base. It had survived every jungle, every ambush, every doubt, and like the men who drove it, it had done so not by being invincible, but by being relentlessly.